Some secrets are not buried by earth, but by the jealous whispers of the heart. This tale begins in the quiet gloom of November, when two sisters are found lifeless in their chamber, and what seems a tragic pact conceals a far darker design. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk the dim corridors of Wyncombe Manor, where Holmes's keen eye unravels the threads of envy, betrayal, and cold calculation. It was upon a bleak November morning, when the fog rolled thick and brown along Baker Street, that I sat opposite my friend in our familiar sitting room. The city beyond seemed hushed in a heavy silence, the clamour of wheels and voices muffled beneath the sooty vapour that clung to window and lamp-post alike. Indoors, the coal fire gave but a meagre glow, casting long and wavering shadows upon the carpet. To an idle observer it might have appeared the picture of repose, yet I knew that my companion's mind, unlike the sluggish world beyond, was active and unsatisfied. The stillness of the chamber seemed but the stage against which Sherlock Holmes's restless intellect demanded movement, as though the very air was strained by some unseen expectation. Holmes had, that morning, turned his attention to what he termed a trifle, the reaction of a certain solution upon fragments of cigarette ash. I watched him with an indulgent curiosity as he bent over his test tubes, his sharp profile lit by the faint gleam of the fire. At times he muttered half a syllable to himself, at others he drummed his fingers upon the table with a rhythm born of impatience. It was a mood with which I was familiar, and one I had long since ceased to mistake for idleness. In those quiet interludes his faculties, denied occupation, grew taut as a drawn bowstring, awaiting the arrow that chance, or providence, would provide. As I turned a page of the newspaper, a sudden rattle of wheels upon the cobbles arrested Holmes's attention. He straightened, with that peculiar quickness which suggested every sense had been awakened at once. Through the grey window pane I caught sight of a dark carriage halting before our door. The step of a servant was heard upon the stair, and even before the knock had sounded upon our chamber door, Holmes had risen to his feet, his keen gaze betraying a curiosity that no chemical experiment could hope to satisfy. "We are to be favoured with a visitor, Watson," he remarked quietly, "and one, if I am not mistaken, of no ordinary station." The lady who presently entered was of middle years, tall and still retaining a distinction of bearing that spoke of gentle birth, yet her countenance, pale as marble, betrayed an agitation she strove with dignity to conceal. Her gloved hands trembled as she inclined her head, and her lips, though compressed in a semblance of composure, quivered beneath the effort. I observed at once the mingling of pride and desperation in her manner, an aristocratic self-command shaken by grief too powerful to master. She carried with her not merely the atmosphere of sorrow, but of urgent necessity, as though some unseen pressure compelled her to seek the one man in London whose judgment she could not afford to ignore. "My name is Lady Eleanor Hartley," she began, her voice low and resonant, though touched with strain. "I come to you, Mr. Holmes, under a weight of affliction such as I had never dreamt to bear. 2 days since, my nieces, the Misses Alice and Margaret Wyncombe, were discovered lifeless in their chamber at Wyncombe Manor. The household, indeed the county itself, is persuaded that the poor girls, overwhelmed by some secret despair, entered together into a dreadful compact, and so ended their young lives. Yet, sir, though appearances speak strongly, my heart refuses that conclusion. I cannot accept that they would have so forsaken their duty, nor that such unnatural resolve could have sprung from their gentle natures. I beg you, therefore, to inquire into the matter, if only to lay a troubled soul at rest." She had spoken with a suppressed fervour that moved me deeply. Holmes, however, betrayed no more than a slight inclination of the head. "Pray oblige me, Lady Eleanor," said he, "with the particulars of their discovery. It is not conjecture, but detail, that brings us to truth." At this, she described how the two sisters had been found, one by the window, the other reclined near the hearth, and between them a glass containing the residue of laudanum. No mark of violence, no disturbance beyond the ordinary had been observed. The physician summoned declared the cause to be poisoning, self-administered and deliberate. To the household, the matter appeared closed. Yet Lady Eleanor insisted that differences of character rendered such a conclusion untenable. Alice, she said, was of the mildest and most retiring disposition, scarce capable of defiance, still less of defiling herself with so dreadful an act. Margaret, more spirited, may have spoken rashly in anger, but her courage was of the living, not the dying sort. I cannot reconcile what I know of them with what has been asserted. Holmes's eyes had grown intent during this recital, and now he leaned forward with that air of sudden, concentrated vigour which I had come to associate with the scent of a trail. "You will forgive me, Lady Eleanor," said he, "if I appear abrupt, but tell me, was the glass discovered between them of a size to contain sufficient draught for two?" She faltered for an instant, surprised by the question. "I believe so, though I cannot speak with certainty." "And were there indications that both had partaken? Two lips, even in death, leave their trace upon such a vessel." Again she hesitated. "I cannot say that such was remarked." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And the chamber itself, was aught displaced? A garment, perhaps, not where one might expect it?" The lady shook her head, perplexed. "Nothing that struck me, sir." He paused, his gaze fixed upon the fire, as though in that shifting glow some pattern already revealed itself to him. I confess that a chill passed through me, for while Lady Eleanor spoke of grief, Holmes had already touched the fringe of mystery. Where others discerned tragedy, he perceived contradiction. It was in that instant I knew his whole being was roused, and that he scented, behind the veil of sorrow, the darker shadow of a crime. Holmes wasted little time in arranging our departure. The gravity with which Lady Eleanor's tale had impressed him was betrayed less by outward expression than by the brisk decision of his movements, and before the morning had waned, we were seated side by side in the train which bore us southward from London. As the city's grey expanse slipped away, I found my thoughts dwelling sombrely upon the nature of our errand. There was in the lady's manner an appeal at once so earnest and so dignified that I could not but feel we carried with us more than a professional inquiry. We bore too the weight of a family's honour and a woman's final hope. Holmes, meanwhile, sat silent, his lean figure bent slightly forward, his eyes fixed upon the shifting landscape. Yet I knew by the tapping of his fingers upon the armrest that his mind was already weaving its web of conjecture. The countryside through which we passed was clothed in that desolate aspect which late autumn lends to Surrey's gentle hills. Fields lay bare beneath a pallid sky, their hedgerows stripped of foliage and their trees standing gaunt, like sentinels keeping watch over the empty land. A mist, not dense but lingering, clung to the hollows and lent a spectral hue to the low meadows. Here and there, a solitary ploughman moved slowly with his team, the figures dwarfed by the expanse and made melancholy by the silence in which they laboured. It seemed to me that even the birds had withdrawn their song, as though nature herself acknowledged the presence of sorrow. I could not resist a shiver, for all the while Lady Eleanor's description of her niece's chamber returned vividly to mind, and the dreariness of the landscape appeared but a sombre echo of the tragedy that awaited us. Holmes alone seemed untouched by the mood, though I fancied the slight compression of his lips betokened a growing resolve. It was late in the afternoon when at last the train deposited us at a rural station, whence a waiting conveyance bore us by winding lanes towards our destination. After some miles of silent progress, we crested a rise, and there, stark against the dull sky, loomed Wyncombe Manor. Its high chimneys and stone gables rose sombre and unadorned, the walls darkened by centuries of weather and streaked with damp. A line of yews bordered the drive, their funereal aspect lending an air of sepulchral gloom to the approach. The lawns, unkempt and shaded by drooping elms, seemed to press close upon, the house as though conspiring to smother it. Even before we alighted, I felt the oppressive spirit of the place. It was not merely that tragedy had visited those walls. Rather, The very fabric of the building seemed to brood over secrets long concealed. Holmes regarded it with a single intent glance, then turned to me with that half-smile I knew so well. "You perceive, Watson," said he softly, "that we are come to a house which keeps its counsel. Let us hope we may yet persuade it to speak." Once admitted through the heavy oak doors of Wincombe Manor, we found ourselves enveloped in an atmosphere of oppressive silence. The hall, vast and panelled with dark wood, was dim despite the hour, the leaded windows admitting little of the pallid afternoon light. Our footsteps echoed along the flagged floor, and I observed the household staff, maids and footmen alike, move with subdued haste, their faces marked with that mingled awe and apprehension which attends the presence of sudden death. Not a voice rose above a whisper, and even the rustle of skirts seemed an intrusion. To my senses, the house appeared to breathe sorrow from its very walls, as though tragedy had passed not merely through its rooms, but had taken up residence there. The hush weighed upon me, and I confess I felt a strange reluctance to intrude further into those darkened corridors. It was here that we encountered Inspector Lestrade, whose thin figure and brisk movements provided an almost jarring contrast to the funereal stillness about us. He greeted us with his customary confidence, declaring at once that the case presented no difficulty. The sisters, he assured us, had chosen to end their lives together by means of laudanum, and there was, in his view, little more to be said. The evidence, as he presented it, was plain. The vessel, the absence of disturbance, the physician's confirmation. To Lestrade, it was a matter already settled, requiring only the formalities of law. His tone, though courteous, bore the faintest edge of triumph, as though to remind Holmes that Scotland Yard was not without its own competence. Holmes, however, offered no argument. With his usual courtesy, he inclined his head, uttering only a few words of acknowledgement, and allowed the inspector's conclusions to stand unchallenged. Yet I, who had learned to read the slightest inflection of his manner, discerned in his stillness the very opposite of acquiescence. His gaze, keen and darting, travelled over the sombre hangings, the faint impressions upon the stair carpet, the subdued countenances of those who passed. More than once his eye lingered upon details so trifling that I should scarcely have credited them with meaning: a speck upon a balustrade, the faint odour of extinguished oil. He moved, as it were, through the house like a man tuning his ear to a distant sound, silent, yet intensely alive to every whisper. For myself, I found the effect unsettling. Lestrade's assurance, though neatly packaged, seemed to me ill-fitted to the atmosphere which pressed so heavily upon us. It was not merely grief that hung in those corridors, but something darker and more complex, as though the house itself resisted the inspector's easy verdict. I noted the rigidity of Holmes's features, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and I knew that beneath his reserve his mind was kindling. It was the quiet before a storm, the signal, familiar to me, that the game, however obscure, was already afoot. At Lestrade's bidding we mounted the broad staircase and approached the chamber wherein the calamity had taken place. The very threshold seemed to weigh upon me, for the hush which reigned throughout the house deepened into something more oppressive as we neared that fatal door. Holmes, who walked a pace before me, paused for the briefest instant with his hand upon the latch, his head slightly inclined, as though listening for some echo which the rest of us could not perceive. Then, with a quiet movement, he entered. I followed, and found myself in a room where the silence pressed heavily, as if the very air retained the solemnity of death. The fire upon the hearth had sunk to ashes, and the curtains were half drawn, admitting a pallid light which threw the scene into a mournful relief. A sense of irrevocable tragedy hung about the place, so that I involuntarily lowered my voice when I spoke. My gaze was drawn at once to the figures of the two young women, still lying where they had been discovered. Alice, the elder, was seated near the window, her head resting against the frame as though in a troubled sleep, her dark hair falling loosely upon her shoulders. Margaret, the younger, reclined upon the rug by the hearth, her hand extended, as though to reach the dying embers. Between them stood a small glass upon the table, its contents reduced to a residue at the bottom. The physician had declared laudanum its poison, and in that vessel lay the supposed explanation of the tragedy. Yet there was a discord in the tableau that I could not reconcile. The one sister so composed, the other collapsed upon the ground, as though they had not shared a single resolution, but had met their fate each in her own manner. The stillness was terrible in its eloquence, and I confess I felt my heart grow heavy as I looked upon them. Holmes, meanwhile, moved slowly about the chamber, his sharp eyes taking in each detail with that unerring concentration which I had witnessed so often before. He stooped to examine the rug, then glanced at the table, then at a chair which seemed ever so slightly awry. His fingers passed lightly over the mantel, pausing where dust was disturbed. To the casual eye the room appeared in order, but Holmes, with his instinct for incongruity, was already assembling the fragments of some hidden narrative. "You observe, Watson," he murmured softly, "that this is no scene of peaceful resolution. There has been movement here, an interruption, perhaps even after the fatal draught was taken." I looked again, and though I could not discern all that he did, I felt that the neat picture of a voluntary pact was already crumbling beneath his scrutiny. The chamber, though hushed, seemed to whisper contradictions that only Holmes could fully hear. As Holmes's gaze traversed the chamber, it came to rest upon a curious blemish upon the carpet between the hearth and the place where Margaret's body lay. He dropped to his knees, and with delicate fingers parted the fibres to reveal a small but distinct patch of scorching, as though some heated object had been set down hastily and withdrawn. To my eyes it was insignificant, a mark such as a fallen ember might easily produce. But Holmes lingered upon it with that peculiar absorption which I had long since learned to respect. "Strange, is it not, Watson?" he murmured. "How the smallest disfigurement in a room otherwise ordered may serve as a cipher to the whole." He straightened, and in the gleam of his eyes I saw that he had already assigned the mark a place in his growing structure of thought. Near the foot of Alice's chair lay a shawl, rich in colour but strangely disposed. Instead of being folded upon the back or fallen from the shoulders, it was twisted and half concealed beneath the table, as though flung aside in haste. Holmes stooped once more, his long fingers adjusting the folds with the tenderness of a curator handling some precious relic. "Observe, Watson," said he softly, "that this garment did not fall by accident. It was wrenched away, and not by the wearer." To the servants, who looked on in bewilderment, such words seemed little more than fastidious trifling, yet I recognized the tone in which Holmes spoke when his mind had seized upon a thread that others could not even perceive. Lestrade, who had watched these proceedings with ill-concealed impatience, now interposed with characteristic bluntness. "Come, Mr. Holmes," said he, "you will not make a tragedy more complex than it is. Here are two young ladies, both with reason enough to despair, and here the plainest evidence of laudanum at their elbow. The thing speaks for itself. This talk of burn marks and shawls is but embroidery upon what every reasonable man must acknowledge, a sad but simple suicide." His manner was firm, as though he sought to forestall contradiction, and he looked to me as though expecting agreement. Yet I could not give it, for though Lestrade's argument held the weight of common sense, I had learned to distrust common sense in the presence of Holmes's sharpened attention. As I glanced at my friend, I observed the slight compression of his lips, the narrowing of his grey eyes, and knew that every fibre of his intellect was alert. Where Lestrade perceived only grief and resignation, Holmes discerned dissonance, details too stubborn to bend to so neat an explanation. A vague unease stole over me, a sense that the chamber's silence was not that of repose, but of concealment. Something lay beneath the surface of that mournful tableau, and Holmes, I was certain, was already listening for its voice. Lady Eleanor received us in the withdrawing room. her bearing composed though touched by the unmistakable stamp of grief. She sat erect, her hands folded upon her lap, her eyes pale with sorrow yet steady, as though resolved that emotion should not overpower duty. I was struck at once by the mingling of dignity and pain in her aspect. She spoke with quiet deliberation, and her voice, though low, carried the weight of one long accustomed to authority. "The poor girls," she said, "were more than nieces to me. Since their parents' deaths, I have been to them both guardian and guide, and it has been within these walls that their lives have unfolded. If I had failed in that trust, then I must bear some share in the tragedy that has overtaken us." For a moment her composure faltered, and I thought I perceived the shadow of tears. She continued more firmly, describing the two sisters in tones which revealed as much of herself as of them. Alice, the elder, she painted as a gentle spirit, contemplative, fond of her books and needlework, shrinking from the rougher encounters of life. Margaret, by contrast, was quick of wit and strong of will, her bright laughter often filling the hall, her temper ready to flare, but as readily appeased. There was a bond between them, Lady Eleanor said, yet not without its frictions. Alice admired Margaret's liveliness, though she sometimes feared it. Margaret loved her sister truly, but could be sharp in word when contradicted. Still, I believed their differences no more than the common play of temperaments within a household. I never thought it could breed so grievous a calamity. Her tone, measured though it was, hinted at undercurrents deeper than her words revealed. Holmes, who had listened without once interrupting, leaned slightly forward, his keen eyes fixed upon her with that intensity which seemed to draw hidden meanings from the simplest speech. It was clear he caught more than the surface of her narrative. Lady Eleanor went on, now touching upon certain occasions when the harmony of the household had been disturbed. There had been quarrels, trivial perhaps, in outward form, concerning matters of preference or pride. Once, Margaret had accused Alice of concealment. Another time, Alice had wept at some harsh retort from her sister. Though Lady Eleanor had smoothed these episodes, she confessed that she sometimes feared a deeper vein of rivalry ran beneath their outward affection. Holmes made no remark, but I observed the slight narrowing of his eyes, the faintest inclination of his head, as though he had already marked in these reminiscences the beginnings of a darker pattern. For myself, I felt a weight settle upon me. The sense that what had seemed mere sisterly discord might, under the relentless lens of my friend's scrutiny, prove the germ of a fatal enmity. At Holmes's request, the household maid, Clara Hastings, was summoned. She entered the withdrawing room with evident reluctance, her hands clasped tightly before her apron, her eyes lowered save for nervous glances cast about her as though seeking escape. She was a young woman of modest appearance, her fair hair drawn back severely, yet her pallor spoke eloquently of sleepless nights and inward agitation. When addressed by Lestrade, her voice trembled, and she seemed at every moment to falter, as though the weight of her words pressed heavily upon her conscience. She declared that it was she who had first discovered the young ladies, lying as they had been described, and that she had raised the alarm. Yet in the very manner of her delivery, there was that which disturbed me. Pauses too long, words too carefully chosen, as though the truth of her experience had been overlaid with a studied recital. Her account proceeded in steady but uneven tones, and it was plain to me that she had rehearsed it. Each sentence appeared formed in advance, yet between them came those moments of hesitation that betrayed her memory was not in harmony with her tale. Lestrade, impatient for clarity, urged her forward with sharp questions, and she complied readily, as though grateful for the direction. But Holmes, seated with eyes half closed and fingers steepled, betrayed by a faint twitch of the lips that her narrative had stirred his suspicion. There was an orderliness about her words that ill-suited the disarray of tragedy, and the more smoothly she spoke, the more apparent became the artifice beneath. At last Holmes broke in, his voice low but incisive. "You say, Miss Hastings, that the glass stood upon the table when you entered. Yet how, then, do you account for its smudge upon the hearth-rug?" The girl started, her lips parting in visible confusion. he continued without pause. "And you describe the shawl as fallen from Miss Alice's shoulders. Yet the folds, as I have observed, speak of force, not chance. Which is it to be, madam?" His words, though courteously framed, cut through her tale with the precision of a scalpel. She stammered a denial, glancing fearfully toward Lady Eleanor. But Holmes pressed no further, content with the fissures his questions had opened in her testimony. I confess my heart softened towards the poor girl. Her distress was palpable, her hands twisting together in an agony of suppressed emotion. Whether this unease sprang from guilt, from dread of unjust suspicion, or merely from the crushing solemnity of her position, I could not then determine. I felt that she stood as one ensnared in circumstances larger than herself, struggling to maintain a fragile composure beneath the penetrating gaze of Holmes. Yet even as compassion stirred within me, I knew that he would not mistake her tremors for proof of crime. His silence, more eloquent than any words, assured me that he discerned beneath her faltering speech a truth yet unspoken, and that in time he would draw it forth. It was not long before the man who had occupied so large a place in the sisters' lives was announced. Julian Arkwright entered the room with an air of studied composure, his features arranged in an expression of grief which seemed almost too deliberate to be natural. He was a tall fellow of graceful bearing, faultlessly attired, and with manners polished by society. Yet I could not rid myself of the impression that beneath his solemn countenance there lurked something theatrical. A note struck rather for the effect upon his audience than from any genuine depth of feeling. His bow to Lady Eleanor was full of gallantry, and even his sigh, uttered as he seated himself, had in it the precision of an actor who knows his part. "I would have given my life to spare them this fate," he began, his voice tremulous, but his hand resting easily upon his watch chain. "Yet I was loyal, faithful, devoted, to the one who had consented to my suit." He spoke the words with a firmness that struck me less as the utterance of a broken heart than as the assertion of a claim. There was in his tone a tincture of pride, as though he sought to remind us of his own constancy and honour, rather than to lament the loss of a beloved. Lady Eleanor inclined her head sadly, while Holmes, leaning back in his chair, observed him with that expression of detached scrutiny which always betokened the most active operation of his mind. Pressed further by Lestrade, who was eager for the man's confirmation of a simple tale, Arkwright admitted, though with evident reluctance, that both sisters had shown him a degree of affection. "I never encouraged it," he protested, "save with the one whose hand I had sought. Yet I cannot deny that the other regarded me warmly, perhaps too warmly for her own peace of mind." He uttered this with a mixture of regret and self-satisfaction, a confession that cast a darker shadow over his earlier professions of loyalty. The revelation altered the air of the room, for what had seemed the tragedy of despair now hinted at the more dangerous entanglements of rivalry and jealousy. Holmes, who until then had remained silent, now stirred and spoke with deceptive mildness. "You visited the manor frequently, I gather, Mr. Arkwright. At what hours were you most accustomed to call?" The suitor hesitated, then gave an answer which Holmes allowed to pass without comment, though I saw his pencil move lightly across a scrap of paper. "And your correspondence with the young ladies? Did it continue up to the day of their deaths?" The question, though gently asked, brought a flush to Arkwright's cheek. He replied with words that were plausible in themselves, yet which fell short of conviction. Holmes's eyes rested upon him with quiet insistence, and in that silence I fancied that more was revealed than in all the man's polished declarations. I felt with a sudden pang of certainty that beneath his grief lay vanity, and beneath vanity, concealment. As Arkwright continued his account, I could not fail to observe a curious dissonance between his words and his bearing. Though he spoke of sorrow, his hand strayed more than once to smooth his well-trimmed moustache, and I caught him, in a moment when he thought himself unobserved, glancing with satisfaction at the polish of his boots, as though their lustre afforded him a secret consolation. It was the conduct of a man not wholly absorbed in grief, but one still mindful of his own appearance. His grief seemed but a garment worn for the occasion, ill-suited and occasionally slipping aside to reveal the vanity beneath. I confess that the sight stirred in me a faint distaste, for the presence of death in such proximity ought to have banished every thought save those of solemnity and reverence. Holmes, however, betrayed no such sentiment. His eyes had narrowed, and he leaned forward a little, his tone soft, yet edged with steel. "You speak, Mr. Arkwright, of promises made," said he, "yet you are curiously imprecise in their nature. Were these vows of affection or of marriage? And when last did you renew them?" The man coloured faintly, then answered with an evasion, speaking of generalities rather than particulars. Holmes pressed on with quiet insistence. "And your correspondence, sir, was it with both sisters, or only with one? The hand of Alice differs from that of Margaret. I think you will agree." At this, his composure faltered, and he shifted in his chair, murmuring that he had written only to the one he claimed as his intended. Still Holmes did not release him. "Your presence near the manor on the very day of their deaths, how do you account for that?" Arkwright's reply was laboured, his manner betraying more than his words concealed. It was then that I observed a curious moment, fleeting yet revealing. Holmes, pausing as though to weigh his next inquiry, directed upon the suitor a glance keen as a blade. Arkwright met it for the briefest instant before his eyes flickered aside, and in that evasion lay more than in all his protestations. Holmes asked but one further question, calm and pointed, which the man answered with an artful circumlocution, slipping past its core without quite denying its premise. I felt a shiver, for in that quiet exchange of glances I read the unspoken truth, that Julian Arkwright, beneath his polish and pride, was a man concealing more than grief, and that Holmes had already touched the nerve of his deception. Holmes, having listened to Arkwright's evasions with an air of imperturbable calm, now expressed a desire to return once more to the chamber of the deceased. Lady Eleanor, though visibly pained, consented, and we followed him up the sombre stair. There he moved with the precision of one who expects discovery, his eyes ranging over the furniture, his hands lightly testing drawer and cabinet. At the small escritoire by the window he paused, his long fingers probing until a faint click rewarded him. A drawer, cunningly concealed, sprang forward, disclosing a disorder of loose papers, letters unopened, and a small Morocco-bound book tied with faded ribbon. The scattered state of the contents spoke to my eye of some hasty interference, yet it was upon the little volume that Holmes's attention settled. "You perceive, Watson," said he, "that a woman's true history is often written in ink, though seldom intended for other eyes." He untied the ribbon, and we bent over the pages together. The neat hand was that of Alice, and her entries, though restrained in expression, carried the poignant weight of unspoken emotion. Day by day she had recorded the small occurrences of their domestic life, her sister's gaiety, her aunt's solicitous care, the visits of Mr. Arkwright. Yet between these quiet lines there crept the shadow of discontent. A tone of wistful envy coloured her reflections, though she strove to mask it beneath phrases of duty and affection. "Margaret is all brightness," one passage ran, "and the house rings with her laughter. I must be content with my needle and my books, though I know not whether she perceives my solitude." Elsewhere her words hinted at some inward struggle, a jealousy half acknowledged, and a sense of being overshadowed within her own home. It was when she wrote of Arkwright that her guarded language gave way to a voice of wounded affection. "He spoke to Margaret in the garden this morning," she confessed, "and I could not help but think his glance once lingered on me. Yet I am but the shadow at her side, and what admiration he may have shown is swallowed up in her brilliancy. Still I feel it, this sharp sting that I cannot name. It is Margaret who is beloved, while I, who watch in silence, am left to my envy." The words, simple and unadorned, carried the weight of a heart torn between loyalty and bitterness. I laid the diary aside with a sigh, feeling that in those pages we had touched the very pulse of the household tragedy. Holmes, however, closed the book with a quiet snap, his expression unreadable, though I fancied that behind his composed features he had already begun to fit Alice's wounded tones into the larger pattern of the case. Holmes had scarcely laid aside Alice's diary when his hand, quick and deliberate, reached again into the concealed drawer. From among the papers he drew a single sheet, folded once and marred by a blot of ink at its corner. It was in Margaret's bold and flowing hand, yet unfinished, its final words trailing off abruptly, as though broken by interruption. Holmes smoothed it upon the desk, his eyes moving swiftly over the lines. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "Here lies not a diary, but a letter, a communication begun, but never dispatched." The half-written page, more raw in its passion than Alice's guarded entries, carried at once an air of secrecy and foreboding. I bent close beside him, conscious that we stood upon the edge of some revelation. The words themselves struck me with a curious force. Margaret wrote of disillusion and reproach, of a promise that had been made to her only to be withdrawn. She alluded to the cruel treachery of one who speaks of honour but acts with deceit, and to a bond broken not by circumstance but by design. The tone was neither vague nor restrained, but direct, almost vehement, as though the letter had been meant as an accusation rather than an entreaty. Her phrases carried the ring of a heart scorned, and though no name was inscribed upon the unfinished sheet, the shadow of Mr. Arkwright seemed to fall heavily across its meaning. The sudden halt at mid-sentence, with the pen's stroke fading into nothingness, suggested that her attempt to set forth her grievance had been violently arrested. I confess that as I read those lines, an ineffable sadness took hold of me. Here, laid bare in ink, was the conflict of affection and rivalry that Lady Eleanor had hinted at, but now sharpened by the intrusion of a lover's betrayal. How cruelly the very bonds that should have bound the sisters in unity had become the medium of their undoing. I reflected upon the frailty of human ties, how love, when poisoned by jealousy, may serve as the most potent of instruments to divide those most intimately joined. The diary had revealed Alice's quiet envy, but this letter spoke with Margaret's proud indignation, and together they formed a mirror of passions that might well end in tragedy. Holmes, throughout, had uttered not a syllable, yet as he folded the paper with a deliberate hand, I observed the fixity of his gaze and the measured stillness of his features. He did not dismiss the letter as the effusion of a wounded heart. Rather, he treated it as a document of weight, a fragment of evidence within a chain not yet complete. His eyes, sharp and meditative, betrayed that he was fitting these words into a pattern invisible to all but himself. Though he left the room in silence, I knew with certainty that Margaret's broken sentences had spoken to him more loudly than any witness could. It was upon our return to the withdrawing room that Lestrade, who had been conversing in low tones with one of the constables, turned suddenly upon the company with the air of a man who believes his case complete. "Mr. Holmes," he announced, "I think we need not trouble ourselves with further conjecture. The guilty party is here among us, and her motive is plain enough. Clara Hastings has long borne the indignities of service in this household, and from all I have gathered, she was subject to sharp words from the young ladies themselves. Resentment festers, and at last she found her means to strike back. The laudanum was within her reach, the opportunity hers. Who else, I ask, could have prepared that glass or arranged the scene? It is as clear as daylight." His manner carried such conviction that Lady Eleanor sank back with a gasp, while the poor maid, who had been standing timidly by the door, started as though struck. Clara's face, already pale, grew ghastly white, and her hands clutched convulsively at her apron. "It is false! False!" she cried, her voice breaking into sobs. "I loved them both, for all their tempers. I would have given my life to save them, not taken it. I never touched their medicines, never entered the chamber that night until I found them so. God knows I speak the truth." But her agitation, Her trembling voice and streaming eyes seemed only to confirm Lestrade in his opinion. "There you see," he said, with a triumphant glance at Holmes, "the very picture of guilt unmasked. She cannot face her crime without betraying it." Holmes, who until then had remained composed and silent, now raised a hand with a gesture of quiet authority. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and even, cutting through the turmoil with a steadiness that compelled attention. "Let us proceed with order, if you please. Miss Hastings, pray tell us, in your own words, the precise sequence of your actions on the evening in question. Begin at the hour of supper, and omit no detail, however trivial it may appear to you. Dates, times, and movements are of greater consequence than protestations of innocence." He leaned back, his eyes fixed upon the maid with a penetrating gaze, yet his tone carried no harshness. Clara, still trembling, strove to compose herself under his scrutiny, while I, watching the contrast between Lestrade's precipitancy and Holmes's methodical patience, felt anew the gulf that ever separated the judgment of my friend from that of ordinary men. Holmes listened to Clara's faltering recital without once interrupting, his eyes fixed upon her with that same unfathomable composure which so often unsettled the nervous witness. When she had concluded, he inclined his head slightly, as though in token of thanks, and then, with a sudden briskness, began to reframe her words into an orderly sequence. "At the hour of 8, said he, "you assisted in the serving of supper and remained below stairs until near upon 9. At past, you carried a tray to Lady Eleanor, whom you left in the withdrawing room. At 10, you retired to your chamber, where you remained until summoned by Lady Eleanor's cry on the discovery of the tragedy. These times agree not only with your account, but with that of others in the household. The poison must have been taken before 10, and therefore before you entered your room. Consequently, unless you are possessed of the power to act in 2 places at once, you cannot have been the hand that prepared the draught." His manner was so clear, so precise, that it seemed to fix each step immovably in the minds of his hearers. Clara gave a sob of relief, and Lady Eleanor's eyes brimmed with tears. Lestrade, however, was by no means inclined to surrender his theory. He cleared his throat noisily, shuffled his boots upon the hearthrug, and declared that the argument was ingenious, yet unconvincing. "For all that, Mr. Holmes," said he, "we cannot ignore her agitation, nor the long-standing resentments that must have weighed with her. She had cause and opportunity." But the inspector's words carried little conviction, for Holmes's demonstration had already sapped their foundation. He lapsed into silence, his expression one of stubborn discontent, while Holmes, without so much as a glance in his direction, continued his examination of the room. It was then that Holmes stooped suddenly, and raising his head, held between finger and thumb the edge of a gentleman's cuff, which had been carelessly thrown upon a chair. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "the ink stain upon this linen. It is fresh, though the inkwell upon the escritoire is nearly dry. Ink has a curious habit of betraying its own chronology." He spoke no further, but I saw at once that this seemingly trivial blemish had struck him as of singular import. To my untrained eye it conveyed little, yet I knew enough of my companion's methods to perceive that he had added another link to the invisible chain he was forging. Holmes's attention next wandered to the fireplace, where only a few grey embers glowed faintly in the grate. With the poker he stirred them gently, and a little cloud of fine ash rose, betraying fragments not wholly consumed. Among them, I fancied I saw the outline of charred paper, its edges curling like blackened lace. "A hasty hand has fed the flames," Holmes remarked. "That which is destroyed in this fashion is oftener damning than that which is preserved." He drew a pinch of the residue between finger and thumb, then let it fall back into the grate. His face remained impassive, yet there was a sharp gleam in his eyes, which told me that here too he had found matter of weight. As I stood beside him, my thoughts turned once more to Clara Hastings, whose terror had so nearly condemned her. How easy it is, I reflected, for suspicion to fasten upon the weak and the helpless, while the true author of a crime may pass for a time unregarded. It was in Holmes's calm, unwavering pursuit of truth amidst a tangle of appearances that I recognized his peculiar genius. Where Lestrade would have hastened to close the case upon a frightened servant girl, Holmes held the field open, patient, until each misleading path was cleared and the straight road revealed. I could not but feel a deep admiration for that steadiness of purpose, which refused to be drawn aside by false trails, however convincing they might seem to common eyes. The hour had grown late when Holmes, with that air of controlled gravity which I had seen upon him only in cases of the most serious complexion, desired that all concerned should be summoned to the great hall of Wyncombe Manor. Lady Eleanor came, her sorrow written in the deep lines about her eyes, yet with the composure of one long schooled to endurance. Lestrade appeared brisk and impatient, clearly believing the matter settled, though curiosity held him from departing. Clara Hastings stood timidly to one side, her eyes swollen with weeping, while Julian Arkwright entered with a solemnity too measured to ring wholly true. I took my place a little behind Holmes, aware that a moment of grave importance had arrived, for never did my friend gather an audience unless he was prepared to lay bare the hidden threads of a mystery. A hush fell upon the company, broken only by the creak of the fire upon the hearth, as Holmes began to speak in low, deliberate tones. You have been led, ladies and gentlemen, to believe that we stand in the shadow of a double suicide, he said. Yet I tell you that what has been accepted at a glance will not endure the test of reason. Consider first the arrangement of the bodies, one by the hearth, one by the window, with a single glass placed between. In such pacts, symmetry is natural, yet here we find an artifice too carefully contrived. Then mark the shawl, laid as if by accident, though in truth placed with studied hand. A woman in the agony of self-poisoning does not trouble herself with such trifles. These details, seemingly slight, bear witness that the scene was composed for our eyes rather than lived in reality. His words, though spoken without flourish, carried with them the chill of undeniable logic, and I saw Lady Eleanor bow her head, as if bracing for some heavier revelation. Holmes moved a pace closer to the table where the laudanum bottle lay. "Let us turn," said he, "to the question of the poison itself. It has been supposed that the sisters drank it by their own choosing, yet the glass shows traces upon the rim that speak of being pressed upon lips unwilling, rather than raised by trembling hands. Laudanum, taken in such a dose, leaves its mark, yet the distribution between the two bodies betrays not mutual resolve, but administration from without. In plain terms, these women did not seek death. Death was forced upon them." Clara gave a sob of horror, while Arkwright shifted in his chair, his composure tightening. "And now," Holmes continued, "we come to those signs which speak not merely of murder, but of a clumsy attempt at concealment. The scorched patch upon the carpet, what is it but the trace of a candle overturned in haste as some incriminating object was thrust into flame? The ashes in the grate, too fragmentary to be of ordinary refuse, are those of papers destroyed in panic. Among them we may discern the outlines of letters, torn and hurriedly burned, lest their contents reveal a motive too damning to endure daylight." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembly, resting for a fraction longer upon Arkwright, whose hand strayed involuntarily to the cuff already marked by Holmes's scrutiny. In that silence, the weight of the truth seemed to settle upon us all, oppressive and inescapable, as though the house itself were holding its breath in dread of the final word Holmes was yet to speak. Holmes's hand, pale and steady, hovered a moment above the escritoire before turning once more to the company. "There is," he said softly, "one witness who speaks without fear or favour, one who cannot be cajoled into silence." His long finger indicated the dark blot upon Arkwright's cuff. Ink is a singularly treacherous companion to the careless criminal. Upon this linen, gentlemen, you see the stain of Margaret's unfinished letter, the very page we recovered from the grate. He tore it in haste, but a fragment clung, transferring its telltale mark. Thus do we know he sought to suppress the words that condemned him. A murmur passed among the assembly. Arkwright shifted, his lips compressing, yet no denial came. Lady Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Clara gazed wide-eyed, as though unable to grasp the enormity of the charge. Holmes pressed forward with a quiet inexorability that brooked no interruption. The motive, too, stands plain. With both sisters removed, Mr. Arkwright would rid himself not only of Margaret's threatened exposure, but also of Alice's silent jealousy. 2 women, each in her way, an obstacle to his comfortable advancement. Their deaths would secure him inheritance through Lady Eleanor's weakened state, and silence forever the whispers of betrayal that Margaret's pen had already begun to set down. Cold calculation lies beneath this thin mask of grief, calculation that weighed money and reputation against 2 young lives, and found the balance worth the crime. His words, though delivered without heat, struck with the force of iron, and for a moment the hall was hushed but for the crackle of the fire. Arkwright's face, once composed, now twisted in fury and despair, but the struggle was brief. Lestrade, though his pride had suffered through Holmes's correction, stepped forward with commendable firmness. "Julian Arkwright, I arrest you on the charge of wilful murder," he said, his voice curt and official. The man made no protest, as the irons were snapped upon his wrists, though his eyes blazed with a look that chilled me to the marrow. Lady Eleanor sank back, her dignity unbroken, yet her sorrow profound. "I feared it," she murmured, scarcely above a whisper. "Better the cruel truth than the false comfort of lies." As Arkwright was led away, the shadows of the hall seemed to deepen, and I felt keenly that we had witnessed not merely a crime unveiled, but a human soul laid bare in its most dreadful poverty. Arkwright was taken into custody without protest. Whatever bravado he had shown earlier deserted him now. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and he walked between the constables with a stiff, mechanical gait. Lestrade, though clearly chastened by Holmes's revelation, conducted the arrest with professional efficiency, keeping his eyes firmly upon his prisoner, as if to prevent even the possibility of escape. A hush followed their departure, and the heavy sound of the door closing seemed to echo through the hall. It was as though the whole house exhaled at last, yet the silence that remained was more mournful than relieved. Lady Eleanor sat very still, her pale hands clasped upon her lap. There was no anger in her face, only a profound sorrow. "The Hartley line is broken," she murmured, scarcely above her breath, "not by death alone, but by betrayal within and without." Her dignity was unshaken, yet in her eyes there glistened the tears of a woman who had seen her fondest hopes undone. Holmes bowed slightly, as though in respect, but offered no word of comfort. He, perhaps more than any man, knew that no syllable could heal such wounds. When at length we found ourselves again in the withdrawing room, Holmes spoke with that reflective detachment which so often followed his greatest exertions. "Watson," said he, "the true calamity in this affair lies not in Arkwright's calculating villainy, grave though that be, but in the envy and rivalry which had already corroded the affections of the sisters themselves. He seized upon the fissure that was there and widened it to his own ends. Had their bond been firm, no deception could so easily have found purchase. His words, quietly uttered, seemed to me like a judgment not upon the dead alone, but upon the frailties of human nature at large. For my own part, I could not shake the melancholy stirred by the writings we had uncovered. Alice's muted envy, Margaret's wounded pride. Here were sentiments born of affection turned sour, of love transformed into rivalry. What should have been their solace became their undoing. I reflected that jealousy, left unchecked, has in it the seeds of a bitterness as deadly as hatred, and that even the tenderest ties may twist into a cord of strangulation when shadowed by suspicion. The following morning, Holmes and I took our leave of Wyncombe Manor. The countryside stretched bleak and grey beneath the November sky, its hedgerows bare, and its fields sodden from recent rain. As the carriage bore us away, I felt the very air laden with melancholy, as though the land itself mourned the lives so cruelly extinguished within its bounds. Holmes sat silent beside me, his gaze distant, and I did not disturb his meditations. It was only when we were once more before the familiar fire of Baker Street that Holmes resumed his accustomed manner. "The tragedy of man, Watson," he said, leaning back in his chair, "is not always in the crime committed, but in the weakness that makes it possible. To master one's own heart may prove, after all, the rarest of victories." He reached for his pipe, and I, sitting opposite, could only reflect that the case of the Hartley sisters had revealed truths as sombre as any we had encountered, and that my friend's words would linger long in my thoughts. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight glinting upon his sharp features, and drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. "My dear Watson," he said at length, "we speak often of villains and their crimes, yet the true peril lies not always in malice, but in the subtle weakness of the human heart. Jealousy, once permitted to fester, can prove a sharper blade than hatred itself. Arkwright merely struck where the ground was already fractured." I pondered his words in silence, reflecting upon the broken affections that had made murder possible. "And so, I turn to you. What do you think was Arkwright's gravest mistake? His cold calculation, or his underestimation of Holmes's eye for truth? If this tale has stirred your thoughts, share them in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries. Perhaps you might even pass this story to a friend who enjoys the shadowed art of deduction.